René-Pier Deshaies has done it again. So let's take a look at their newest creation from Fari-RPG, Songs and Sagas. Hello everybody, and thank you all for joining us again here today on Hesens County for another SRD Talk. This video series takes a look at the various resources that are out there with describing various systems that you can use to base your own role-playing games on. Today we're going to be taking a look at this one, Songs and Sagas. As I mentioned in the intro, this is from René-Pier Deshaies of Fari-RPG. Of course, the person who also created a number of other systems and games that we've covered on the channel before. And I very much doubt that this one will be the last one. We're not going to be taking a look at the game itself. Instead, we're going to be taking a look at the SRD, which of course is the system reference document that you can use to potentially create some games of your own. This is a relatively unique SRD, and that the primary form that it takes is that of a Notion site. I admittedly am not the biggest of fans of utilizing this as the sole way of transmitting your system reference document. I will admit I have a pretty significant bias. Those of you who follow me on social media and whatnot for printed versions, partly because I admittedly have some vision and focus issues when it comes to looking at screens for long periods of time. Notion in particular will admittedly, from what I understand, has some accessibility issues, at least if you're using it generically. But I can definitely appreciate the fact that especially creating it and this style of system, it's this style of like website and stuff would make it a lot easier for some people to use. So I definitely understand that. Anyway, Songs and Sagas is a sort of I guess OSR/NSR, new school Renaissance role-playing game that could be played solo or collectively as a group. That basically is trying to tell a primarily narrative story while also being a hex crawl. So we'll talk about some of the ways and some of the principles, some of the ways this just kind of comes through in the SRD. Before moving on to the mechanics and stuff like that and the actual creation of a game utilizing this system, one thing that I felt was important to discuss is the actual license and attribution, because of course this is very important if you want to potentially make a game using this system. So the most important thing here is the fact that the game utilizes both the game and the creator kit are licensed under ORC. For those of you who are not familiar with the ORC license, this is that license that was created that has a lot of similarities to Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike license in that there are again you can use a significant portion of the materials unless the license dedicates them as being reserved material. So oftentimes, for example, illustrations like Galen Pujol's illustrations from the game and also that are included in the SRD website are not considered a part of this. Normally, setting materials would also be included amongst reserved materials, but in this case, actually, if I'm reading this correctly, René-Pier actually waived his license to the settings here with this statement. Pretty much all the other materials you are allowed to use, as long as you also use ORC license. That's that share alike part. Whenever you're creating your game, also have to use ORC. But again, it does provide some extra protections to like items you put in your game and stuff when it comes to those reserved materials, so that you don't have to share everything, unlike an actual Creative Commons share alike license. There are a couple of smaller differences and distinctions, but I'm not going to dive into those today. Taking a look at the the system principles and goals. This is kind of covering specifically the things that not only Songs and Sagas was trying to do, but also some other elements that RP was trying to introduce into the system in order to make it easier for you, the creator, to create certain types of games. And just to kind of focus on some of the specifics of these, here, of course, RP points out we have self-driven exploration. As I mentioned, the original game is a hexcrawler. So that's pretty key to the elements of the game, including, the things that, depending upon which hex you're in and stuff, new locations will increase or decrease the risk rating, and which partly controls like how difficult certain rolls will be and stuff like that. Another thing that comes through is a combination of basically these three things that they point out, that RP points out, and that is the balance of tension, narrative control, and risk taking. I find that these kind of come through, particularly when we're taking a look at the way that cards are used, and also the way that, because this system does utilize cards, the combination of, the cards that help balance certain elements of tension that can be used by the player in order to help them, but also if you bank that too much, it can also hurt you. And then also, no matter what, whenever you are taking a risk or doing a roll or whatever, that you are, if you're succeeding, then that's great and you have full control of the narrative, and that's great. That's obviously good for the player. But even when you do suffer a setback or this system's version of a failure, you're still learning, because this has a system where you're gaining XP whenever you fail. Again, as I mentioned, obviously it's solo friendly. And then finally, another thing is, of course, this is built on that sort of OSR, NSR sort of feel. So in many ways, your player, your characters should not necessarily feel like, superheroes kind of plowing through everything. There are definitely elements of risk, elements of that feeling where you are a small fish in a very big pond with a lot bigger fish flying around you. Let's go ahead and dive into the system reference document itself. So before we jump into like how to create a character, the elements of that and everything, I wanted to jump in and talk a little bit about some of the mechanics. So this game uses a combination of cards and dice, specifically, and that it takes, and that combination of cards and dice influences basically the entirety of the game from beginning to end. Here, this section specifically is talking about how, for example, you create new sections on the Hexmap as you start to explore. Basically, you're using your D20 to create like the different adjectives and terrain, or D10s to create various points of interest and stuff that are occurring on your map, so you can write in what's happening in the region. And you are also using the cards to basically create what that risk rating is. So obviously some places are more dangerous than others. So here you can obviously see where we have both the influence of the dice and the cards together at the same time. Now, if my character is acting in the game, how do we resolve this? Well, essentially there are two different types of resolution rolls. We have trial rolls and we have fate rolls. Trial rolls are whenever I am doing an action that could be considered risky, or that might have some negative potential consequences, while a fate roll is essentially, again, when the outcome could be potentially uncertain, but if I fail, there's not like super important consequences that could result from that. Whenever doing a fate roll, there isn't any chance that the player could potentially gain any experience points, because again, if you're not risking, if you're not creating that situation of risk, then there's a smaller chance of actually like learning something from it, let's say. So anyway, trial roll first. Obviously the first thing you do is you need to pick which attribute kind of applies to this particular action that you're attempting to do, whether it's like strength or heart or something like that. We'll talk about those a little bit when we describe sort of like the structure of a character in this system. But the main reason for that is just so that you know what bonus you're going to be applying to your roll, because this is a D20 system when it comes to the resolution mechanic. So you're rolling a D20 and you're adding the attribute modifier. The second thing that, of course, needs to be done is that the GM or the player, if they're playing solo, needs to determine the difficulty of the roll, which you can see the table down here. So, of course, we've got rating numbers between a 6 and an 18, depending upon whether the action is pretty much guaranteed to succeed, all the way down to being almost impossible, with the average being around 12. The GM will then reveal each hex, as we mentioned previously, has a risk has basically a risk rating that there is a chance that the whenever an action is being done in this location, that it's going to be more risky, right? So because of that, the GM or the solo player will draw a number of dice equal to this number right here, 1, 2, or 3, depending upon when what that number was when the hex was originally created. And for each black card, this difficulty rating will actually be increased by 2. For example, let's say I have an average roll. I'm in an area where the risk rating was 2, so the GM would flip over 2 cards. If either of those is black, so a spade or a club, then I would add 2 to that 12 to get the difficulty rating. So let's say just one of them is, and so now it's a 14. So I, the player, will then roll my d20, add in my attribute modifier or any other elements that I'm utilizing to potentially give me a boost, and then we see if I succeed. If you, of course, roll higher than that difficulty rating, this is considered a success. If I do have a success, then that means that me, the player, has full narrative control over what happens next. And also, if I would like to, and I did not utilize a card, I can pick up one of the cards that was laid out on the risk pile. And I have to pick a red card over a black card. And this actually has 2 different elements to it. The first is that I can use those cards to benefit me later, which we'll talk about in just a second. But the second element of it is that means that card, when it's in my hand, is not going back into the deck. And because it's in my hand and not in the deck, that actually increases the risk moving forward. Because obviously, if there are more red cards out of the deck and in people's hands, players' hands, than there are in the deck itself, then that is increasing the chance that future hexes that you move into are going to have higher ratings, and also it's going to increase the chances some of the other like randomization tables and stuff like that we'll talk about in a little bit later. A lot of those have red cards are positive, black cards are negative, so they increase the chances of those generators coming up negative as well. So another important thing to consider. So that's a good reason to not necessarily hoard your resources, because as you hoard those red cards, those resources, you're actually making it harder for you ultimately in the grand scheme of things. So anyway, once the roll has succeeded, again, I can pick up one of those cards and I can burn it to gain stuff later. If I get a setback, then I give up narrative control. The game master takes over instead, or the opposition in my head, again, if I'm doing this solo. However, I also get to mark an experience point. The GM will then describe what happens and potentially introduce new tension if that makes sense, like introducing a new consequence, like my armor or weapon gets damaged. I get hurt, so I lose some of my resilience. I gain a new condition. Something happens that disrupts my goal in this particular area or something. As I mentioned, you can burn cards in your hand. Again, you're picking up red over black, but it doesn't really matter what color it is. Once it's in your hand, you just use it. And it doesn't make that big of a difference what the color is. Again, you can use these cards to boost rolls. So you could call on the gods and add +2 to your own score, or you could play a card and add +2 to an ally's roll if they're rolling and if it's their turn instead. One thing that you also can do is after the roll has already been completed and you've determined that you have a setback, you could burn a card to basically force it to be a success, but the GM gets to introduce some new consequence, so it's more like a success with consequences. So again, here we are introducing another layer of narrative control for the player, because they are the one who chooses whether or not that full failure, let's call it, goes through or not. Finally, the last thing is that you can burn a card in order to add an item to your inventory and basically pretend like it's always been there. This is similar to sort of like flashbacks games like Blades in the Dark, where but instead of being like a pre-prepared action, it's you basically gain an item in your thing. Again, the way items, we'll describe the way items work here in a little bit, but the important part for here is that you can use it to actually reduce the difficulty rating of a roll if that item is useful, potentially. But of course, GM gets a final decision on whether or not your item can be used or whether or not it makes sense for you to have been carting around that item this whole time. Speaking of items, as we mentioned, right, items can be used to reduce the DR of a roll. However, there are two types of items that are special, and those are armor and weapons. Armor basically is used in order to deal damage, and armor is used to resist damage, and weapons, of course, deal damage. And very similar to RP's breathless system, the armor and the weapons each have a die value assigned to them. For weapons, it's somewhere between a D4 to a D12, and for armor, it's somewhere between a D4 and a D6. And basically, the higher quality the item, the higher the value of the die that you roll to determine how much damage is being inflicted or is being prevented to that character's resilience. Again, whether it's a PC or NPC or whatever. One thing that's important to note is that unlike in Breathless, where every time you use an item or an ability, the value of that die steps down. Instead, here, the armor or the inventory only steps down whenever it's damaged, which is typically a consequence of a failed roll, a setback, or again, if you turn to the tables with your card, then potentially a success with consequences. Those can potentially damage your items, and you can repair them eventually whenever you're taking a rest or something, which we'll talk about a bit. As I mentioned, you do have a resilience as a character. This essentially operates as your hit points. The reason why I'm mentioning it here instead of in the section where we're going to talk about creating a character and stuff like that is because whenever your resilience hits 0, this actually triggers a special roll. Again, resilience, I described it as hit points, but it's not just your physical health, like hit points typically are whenever we're taking a look at a game like Dungeons & Dragons, but rather it's your entire physical and mental well-being. Anyway, as I mentioned, whenever it hits 0, you do have to do a trial roll. If you succeed that trial roll, then that means your resilience it's essentially kind of like a death save to a certain extent, where if you succeed, then your resilience is still at 1 and you haven't gone down yet. However, if you do get that setback, then instead you're incapacitated. Basically, you're knocked out for the scene, and if you are then healed or tended by someone else, your resilience will go back up to 1, but you gain a new condition. And here in this section here, we're describing conditions. So it says here, conditions are negative aspects that have been attached to your character. Each condition takes at least 1 inventory slot. So one thing that's important to note is that conditions actually reduce the number of items and things that you can carry around with you. It says here, to clear a condition, you need to have a full rest or wait until it becomes relatively irrelevant. And the GM can invoke conditions also to increase the difficulty ratings of rolls, just like how items can decrease the difficulty ratings of rolls. If I haven't mentioned this earlier, one thing that's important to note is that there are little tabs that you can open up and to describe various notes that René-Pier has included in the SRD that tell you a little bit more about how you might want to utilize this system and stuff like that. So it says here, basically conditions aren't a predetermined thing, at least in René-Pier's versions of the game, and so they're kind of left open. So now let's kind of hop in to talk about some of the elements that are incredibly important for when it comes to creating a character. As I mentioned in the when we were discussing the roles, your character does have attributes. Again, these attributes are kind of set based on the number itself is a modifier to the roll. So this is one of those games where we skip the whole, well, it's got to be somewhere between 3 and 18, and that creates a modifier. No, we're going straight into the modifier. So in the sort of base elements of Songs and Sagas, you have 4 attributes. Of course, you could have more, you could have fewer, and of course, you could change specifically what they are. But the basic idea is that you have attributes. In the base game, they are strength, dexterity, willpower, and heart, because again, we are mainly focusing on exploration and fighting and sneaking around sometimes, or exploring means, of course, that sometimes you have to focus and solve problems and talk to people and persuade them and stuff like that. So when you are creating your character, you will reveal a card for all 4 of your attributes. If you get a red card, then obviously you get a positive bonus under that attribute. If you get a black card, then you either get no bonus or a actual small detriment. Another thing that your character will have is archetypes. Archetypes, again, are considered to be kind of like a class. In this particular case, in Songs and Sagas, they're called Venori, because actually they're spirits that follow you, and they give you bonuses to certain attributes. They set your initial max resilience, and they give you a special ability. It also says here that you could actually use, at least in the Songs and Saga system, the Songs and Saga game itself, that you could burn a card in order to actually conjure up or summon essentially your Venori, your guardian spirit, to take a physical form, and therefore it can act essentially like an item, potentially reducing certain difficulty ratings for certain roles for a little while. So it gives you, so the actual game itself gives you 6 different options. Here you can see they're boosting one attribute by 2 and a second attribute by 1 in each of these cases. It also gives you, again, your setting max resilience. So for example, here for the bear, we have a D10 plus 3. And then finally, also, it gives you a special ability. So a good one here would be like Raven. So it says that you can burn a card in order to force the enemy to step down their damage die. So, and some of them don't actually directly impact the actual situation going on the ground. So for example, here for the owl, once per session, it says that you can burn a card in order to gain experience points twice instead of just once. One thing to note here is that this sort of archetype system, the way it's structured here, there is no way to really improve your class. You just kind of have it, and then you improve other aspects of your character instead. However, that's of course something that you could potentially play around with if you decide to create this system. So diving into the last element of the characters that we haven't really discussed yet, and that is experience. In Songs and Silence, the game itself, you do have, again, you're marking XP each time you get a setback. And there is an XP track on the character sheet that has 8 boxes in it. Once all those boxes are filled, then you trigger a blessing from your Venori, or an advancement. The way that Songs and Silence is set up is that you are only improving your character's attributes and resilience. There isn't like an additional element or mechanic or something that you can potentially improve or like gain extra abilities or stuff like that. You're only changing those things. So just like when you originally were creating your character, you're going to be utilizing the cards to again, for each of your attributes, and then also for your resilience. So again, you're either improving here, as you can see on the tables, you're either improving your attribute by 2, 1, or if you get a black card, it doesn't actually change. And actually, if you get a spade, then you see a bad omen. So you see that some bad things are happening in the future. Again, with your changing your resilience, it's the same thing. If you pull a red card, then it's improving. Black cards means it's staying the same. If you get a spade, then that means you get a vision, which again, typically the vision means that you're like being set on a certain adventure or whatever. Finally, last thing, oracles. The game does utilize a card oracle system. Whenever you have to answer a question, your character is not directly involved in the outcome, and there's a yes or no question. So basically what you'll do is so it says here that you'll flip over one card whenever like luck, it's just totally luck, or you'll flip over extra cards for each additional advantage or that could potentially increase the chances of a positive outcome. If you reveal 2 red cards, then it's a strong yes. 1 red card is a weak yes, and no red cards means the answer is no. And again, this also ties into that whole like keeping cards in your hand and burning cards and stuff like that, because obviously if you're keeping a lot of resources, then you're more likely to have an answer that's no. Which again could, depending upon things, be pretty negative for your character. So that was Songs and Sagas. I'm sure there's some elements that I potentially skipped that would be interesting for some of you all to take a look at, but I think I've covered enough of the basics here that we can definitely, focus on what kinds of games you might want to create with this. Again, this is very clearly and specifically designed for exploration and, with the hex crawling system and stuff like that. So that would be a good, obviously, this is a good system to create those styles or types of games. Another thing I could potentially see this game being useful for would be a journey styles, in which case you might want to add additional resources and stuff that could potentially affect things. So, for example, like kind of the way that resources work, like in the Carta system or something, where the more you explore, if you're not finding resources like food and stuff along the way, then you're potentially going to run into problems or have to like reset or backtrack or whatever. And again, you could potentially rely on multiple decks instead of having everything run off of one deck. For that second deck, use that instead of the D20 and rolling tables to determine what you find in each hex. Again, kind of like how Carta works. So kind of like blending together Carta and this sort of Songs and Sagas system would be a potential interesting way to take a hex crawl. Okay, again, thank you all for joining us again here today on Hessens County for this look at the Songs and Sagas SRD. Again, this was created by René-Pier Deshaies. Links will be found down below. Art, including the logo, was created by Galen Peugeot. You cannot download a PDF, but I was able to kind of jank up a printable version of this, so that's at least it's an option. But yeah, definitely an interesting way to present it. So feel free to take a look and have a good zone. And don't forget to rate your itch purchases.